Propel, as we discussed very at the beginning, is try to solve, the pain points of capitalization of the whole capturing, first of all, of knowledge, as you mentioned, many issues in the sector with staff retention, rotation, people leaving, also working in a bit over stressful kind of context, particularly when we're talking about humanitarian interventions, and also lack of resources in the sector as well. And secondly, the lack of really integrating the learning, the L part on monitoring, evaluation, and accountability. So the learning is actually just checked sometimes in reporting and saying, what do we really mean? And that's why in today's session, I will introduce very quickly what we are developing in Propel, but with a strong focus on the learning agenda. So what actually an effective learning agenda means and how that can improve programmatic, but also organizational learning. So I'm just started join very quickly the dashboard of Propel. So basically we launched this view actually just before the end of the year. So it's quite new, and we also still, piloting and experimenting what kind of information users would like to see on this specific dashboard. So at the moment, as you can see, we can see the updates of projects that you are part of. So basically, if a specific learning activity, learning question has been added, and I will walk you a little bit on detail on what that means on Propel. Also, upcoming activities. So what we're also trying to do with Propel is trying to embed learning into the into the project and the organizational working flow or work cycle. So here we can actually plan different activities, and just to see how they can be actually integrated on capturing and reflecting on what works and what doesn't. And then we can see the projects that you are part or are a member of. So with Propel, I will just show you a demo that we have actually developed following and focusing on some information from this peace and stability program in Darfur, funded by different UN agencies. So it's all publicly information available. Trying also a little bit to provoke as well how the good implementation of programs could capitalize on better outcomes and how learning could efficiently reflect on adaptations, particularly talking about the context of Darfur, and see how, learnings really could improve adaptive programming and also the implementation of programs. So how you started in Propel is basically starting by creating a project with the key project details, and it's up to each organization what kind of information should be included here. Normally, it should be at least the impact, so the ultimate goal of the project, basic information a little bit about the intended outcomes, and then it can go a little bit in detail about the log frame or output or activity level, depending also on how detailed information organizations will benefit out of this. Then the duration of the project, so the implementation dates. Then locations or location. It can be a country, it can be a province, it can be a region. And already the topics or key themes of the project, and in this is already starting to reflect on what actually these are the key, themes or topics that this specific project is going to be focusing on. And throughout the implementation and the piloting of Propel with different organizations, just the identification of these topics is already a super interesting exercise for them to really reflect and say what actually, what key pillars or topics do we really want to focus on this specific program. And ideally, this identification as well should be done, we were talking about good practices, jointly, with implementing partners and all the people involved in the project implementation, just to make sure that they also have an understanding of what do they actually mean with these specific topics and terminologies, just to make sure that everyone is actually on the same page.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick
please
question?
Go ahead. Sure.
Is each individual organization able to customize the topics to match their own organizational pillars then?
Indeed.
The list of topics? Okay.
Indeed. Cool. So first, that's a very good question, actually, because in order to create a project, first you need to create an organization.
Okay.
So basically, in this case, is under Propel, this project, because it's our demo. But when you
Right.
create an organization, you then create who is part of that organization, what are the key topics that organization works, and also the locations.
Awesome.
And then that is actually bring down to the sub level of creating the project based on those metadata. That was a very good intervention, Ariel. Thank you. So once we create a project, then you can invite team members to the project. Those can be, and that's also, as you might have experienced, Ariel, during your experience in the sector, is that sometimes you have consortia implementing, big kind of programs, and the learning part or the learning component is only implemented by the one specific organization, so not all the consortia, which is also one of the issues on why there are so many, gaps in what actually organizations do learn. So the good practice is actually to include as many relevant people, not only inside the organization, but within the consortia, in the case that is a big program, to make sure that everyone actually have ownership and accessibility to the project. And then, of course, the learnings that we'll walk a little bit in detail now. So once you have created a project, then the first step of Propel is start. This is what we call the learning dashboard. Is start by creating actually a learning question. So then is where we start to capitalize a little bit on also on the topic of today, on really how to create an efficient or effective learning agenda that not only capitalize on programmatic learnings, so what is actually your program learning, but also how can fit in to a more ambitious goal, focusing on organizational learning and what actually the organization would like to learn from the implementation of different programs. But first, we have to focus at the micro level, which it will be the program implementation of program learnings. So you start basically by creating, again, ideally, this should be done in a collaborative manner. And also when we are talking about the timeline of the project, ideally it should be done before, during the baseline or before the implementation, before the project starts, just to agree as well between consortium members of team members, what are the key themes and what are the key learning questions that the team would like to have or the consortium would like to have about this. So prioritizing programmatic learning, organizational learning as well. And if we want to focus on best practices, it will be having an open conversation with the donor and say actually as well what it will be the ideal learnings that the donor also would like to have out of this project. So we're talking about a very best practices over here and how things should be done. So we start by creating a learning question. Each learning question, again focusing on best practices, should have a specific timeline. So that's also, we have this functionality on Propel that a learning question should have a deadline or timeline aligned to it. So it's just to align as much as possible when, as a project, we are thinking to answer this specific learning question. And this should be integrated ideally with the project, with activity plan. So basically imagine that you are conducting specific training, or in this specific learning question, so we're talking about the strengthening of homegrown conflict resolution. So for sure, in this kind of project, there is a lot of community awareness and training on how local communities actually can resolve local disputes through informal justice mechanisms, for example. So if organizations are providing a training and providing these kind of tools and capacities for local communities to solve these kind of issues, ideally, some reflection and learning activities should be happening after these trainings, so you can reflect and improve how actually the program is being implemented. So ideally, this should be aligned with the project activity plan. So that is the whole timeline of, or putting a specific time basically to the learning agenda, to the learning question, sorry. Then when we're talking about ownership, each learning question should be assigned to some team members or organizational members or consortium members. It could be one person and it could be more than one person. So I will assign this to myself, for example, and Arm, one of my colleagues. It's just also to create this kind of ownership on who really is the ultimate responsible for this, despite there is a joint effort. But we also need to start dividing roles and responsibilities when we also talk about learning. Then, based on the metadata and information that it was included at the inception, so in the project description, these learning questions should be related to a specific location, because we can also have, if we're, for example, talking about deficiency or how trainings are actually implemented in different regions or different provinces of Sudan, we can have the same learning question for one specific province and the same one for other, and just see actually the differences in the results of the intended outcomes. So that is a little bit to see and correlate the information. And also the good practice is that a specific learning question should be also related to one of the topics or topics that the project actually have identified. So in this specific case, this learning question is related to peace building. This is important also to try to focus on the answering, but as well, and I will walk you later on that, is to capitalize on the aggregation and the filtering and searching for learnings specifically related to peace building throughout the implementation of the program, but also once the program has closed. So you can see at an organizational level, what are you learning related to peace building? Any questions or comments so far?
No, I think this is really interesting. I guess I'm curious to see kind of how the learnings or that like the knowledge itself is then organized.
That
But I'm sure you're
to
getting
be
to that.
captured.
Perfect.
So this, thank you. So this is a little bit the creation of the learning agenda or learning overview on Propel. So you can have a key learning question, and then sub learning questions and sub learning questions. So you just create it by adding these sub learnings. Another practice as well that throughout the piloting of Propel, some organizations are doing is to relate specific learning questions to outcomes or even result areas. That also can be a good practice if you want to also to keep a little bit your learning agenda more aligned with your monitoring and evaluation framework or your logical framework, or even your theory of change. That can also be an option. However, the way that we also foreseeing as well the use of Propel and also focusing on best practices, as sometimes there is, not sometimes, most of the times, there is a lot of learnings that happen outside specific outcomes. What is called about unintended learnings or unintended project results that don't really fit into specific outcome areas. So the idea of keeping the learning agenda a little bit more open, perhaps focusing on teams and locations, it gives a little bit more flexibility to a learning agenda, which is a super important component of a good learning agenda. The flexibility and adaptability of the learning agenda, because particularly when we're talking about this specific program, focusing on a little bit of conflict areas, context is very important. So questions sometimes need to be updated and changed based on also the insights and the context coming actually for the program. So the flexibility and adaptability of the learning agenda is super important, and it's also what we're trying to reflect here in Propel. So it's basically a live learning agenda that could be adapted, changed, and even challenged by different team members. So that's the first step, basically, setting up your learning questions, validating these learning questions with different team members. So just to make sure that everyone got a little bit of understanding of what the program actually is trying to learn, which is also part of this ownership and accessibility part that we're also trying to create by the use of Propel. So all the team, our project members, would have access to this information. And capitalizing on what you mentioned on the answering part, what we have developed in Propel is the adding learning activities. So when a training has been implemented, for example, here we're reflecting on conflict management mechanisms. So we have implemented different sessions with community members, and we have the data or the experience to reflect on what is working, what is not working, is when we go to the moment of capturing those learnings. What we have done in Propel is to create specific templates to support users, project members, to capture those learnings in a standardized way. So then these learning stories and these insights can be actually aggregated at a organizational level. So in this example, we are jumping directly to an after action review, which is actually one of the most used templates in the software at the moment. By default, you will have today's date at the top. So it's basically when this activity is being conducted and by whom, which is myself as the user. I can also add other team members. So I will take advantage of Novia and ARM are here, for example. And this is a little bit capitalizing or reflecting on what you mentioned, Ariel, at the beginning of saying, how do we ensure that there is actually retention of knowledge, particularly considering the whole staff retention rotation in the sector, and also who took part of that specific learning activity, even if the person is gone or is actually transferred to another program or a country, you know that this was actually validated by X numbers of project team members. And after action reviews, a rather simple, straightforward template with 5 key components. Basically, Propel tries to guide users by using this placeholder text on supporting the user on what kind of information should be there. And it's basically reflecting on what was supposed to happen in the implementation of a specific activity, what actually happened in reality. And then always all Propel templates will finalize with these 3 key areas, which is basically highlighting successes, which is basically opportunities, challenges, and learning and adaptations. So all the templates will finalize that way, because it's basically capitalizing on how to really focus on best practices, lessons learned, focuses mostly on challenges, opportunities, and key learnings or adaptations for the future. The same would be for the retrospective. It's a little bit more longer at the beginning in terms of the questions that you're trying to answer, more contextual information, but then it would always end up with these 3 key learning questions. So basically, once learning activities are still to be captured on Propel, Propel will be developing this kind of learning or discovery timeline, as we call, where you'll be able to reflect all the different learnings. And as you can see, you have the opportunities, the challenges and opportunities as specific learning cards that could be accessible to all team members, and depending, of course, on the edit or admin rights that users do have, they are able to edit and adapt these activities. Also focusing a little bit on what we mentioned before on adaptive management approach, and see also reflecting on real-time learnings, as you can also edit the learning questions throughout. So this is a little bit focusing on how do we capture learning and document learnings on Propel and disseminate it throughout the learning agenda, because that's also, as you can see over here, I was actually working on this specific learning question 8 minutes ago. So this is also a way to reflect a little bit accountability and usage of how the team actually is supporting or working on the learnings. And it's also to validate even, and that is actually what we've seen actually during the piloting, there are learning questions that are actually have not been implement any learn activity, for example, this one 5 months ago. So then it's also the moment to say, okay, is this actually question not relevant enough? Or do we don't have throughout the project implementation enough project activities to have the evidence to be able to answer this specific learning question. So that's also the interesting part of aligning the timing on this. So just also to provoke or challenge, team members, just to see how relevant that specific learning question was, or perhaps it needs adaptation.
Just a
Um,
quick question. Oh, sorry.
yes,
And
please.
let me know. We can get back to this. I don't want to interrupt, but I'm just wondering, kind of as you're like onboarding new clients, or it sounds like you kind of have a pilot going on at the moment, how
Yes,
you're encouraging them to kind of incorporate this into their workflow. I know from working at a nonprofit, it's usually super busy and low understaffed often. So just kind of wondering how you're kind of encouraging them to make time for this as they're working.
that's a very good question, and even uh, challenging a little bit the way that organizations do work. And for that, the whole introduction of a new tool, and that's for anyone lives, whatever it is in the private sector, public sector, or nonprofit, is always a little bit of a burden. So it's a new tool, is the adoption, the getting used to it, and also the whole onboarding and training. However, possibly I would say there is more consciousness or more acknowledgement about the need to really capitalize on what actually we are doing in international development. I think the SDGs also as a proxy or as a target, we can see that there is not enough data to see actually what would happen in the next 5 years. That is the target of the SDGs. If we look even at information, they say that we are actually 30% of the target, so meaning that we have 5 years to do 70% to achieve them. So there is, first of all, a little bit of a public awareness and consciousness about the importance of learning in the sector. And secondly, is a little bit of more of donor pressure. I don't know what is your experience with the Canadian Development Agency, but I think they're quite innovative in learning. But at least from my experience working a lot with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, but also DFID, FCO now, they actually request grantees basically, or NGOs, to allocate a specific budget that focus mostly on monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And we are talking about that is almost 8% to 10% of the total budget. So there is actually facilitating, let's put it that way, the resources to make sure that organizations have the capacity and the staff to do so. But that is the framework. And the reality is more about the organizational culture, after all. Do they really allocate enough time to focus on the learnings? And the way that we're also doing it is also supporting them on not only capture what works for the sake, of course, of accountability and what's supposed to be done, but also because now much more donors are requesting as well during the proposal stage, or even when a project is implemented, the development of a learning agenda. So they have a learning agenda component on the reporting. So that is a little bit aligned with some of our user cases from our piloting partners that are requesting, for example, exporting the information from Propel into a PDF, which is something that we actually made available last year. So also to align, for example, specific learning questions to reporting periods. So that is also something that we are testing and piloting, and how to embed learning into the day-to-day, or weekly, and also have the spaces and the time to reflect about this with specific, piloting partners, or even implementing CSOs or implementing partners. But it's still a challenge. Huh? It's definitely, Propel is not one size fits all kind of solution, because at the end, it's up to the users to really, capture, allocate the time, and embed learning into their organizational culture. But I think more and more, the proxy or the standard is getting higher. So I think it's a little bit aligned also with improving ways of working in the sector as well, and being more efficient, effective, and also adapt better. And of course, for a more business development approach, the capturing lessons learned or capturing best practices serve organizations as well to improve their programming in the future. So also and knowledge is power, 100%, in terms of really knowing what works, in terms of interventions, practices, and that aligns 100% with evidence-based decision making, and as well at more organizational level or more policy making level is actually influencing policies or organizations when we're talking about advocacy programs, for example, based on the evidence that they have collected throughout the project. So it's also making the whole accountability, transparency more, stronger, I would say, but still a long way to go, Ariel. I completely agree. So that's why we're really trying to see how the adoption and implementation of Propel by our piloting partners that, as you mentioned, we're piloting since um, actually over a year, since January 2023. So, and we are also adapting and developing some features based, of course, on the 360 kind of feedback that we get from our piloting partners that range from international NGOs to local NGOs in different continents. I don't know if you
That's
have
great.
any.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's awesome. Thank you so much.
And then last, because also just looking at the time to have some time to reflect, is once learning question has been answered or already completed, you can change, or team members can change, the status, let's call it that way, of specific learning question. So once team members have agreed and validated that this we have enough evidence or enough learning activities to call this to close the question or to mark it as done, it is also something that we're also make available in the software, so also to track the progress of different learning questions and learning activities. And once during the project implementation, while team members do collect learnings, something that we have developed for our users is to focus a little bit on how do we visualize those learnings in a little bit of an interactive way. We call it knowledge maps, just to support and capitalize a little bit on what has been done, and also to share information across internally. So it can be across the organization in a country office, or also across the organization if we are talking about big NGOs that have regional offices, headquarters. So the idea of this is that you can, based on the metadata, on the initial organizational information and then project tags that have been created, we can see actually what the organization in this specific case is learning on peace building. So as you can see here, different insights or learnings come up related to specifically peace building. So you can also click on this and see in detail where these specific learnings are actually coming from. You can click on it, see to which specific project and even learning activity is related to, so you can track them down. So ideally, also in terms of the future of the product development of Propel, the idea is that you're able to share and also chat with specific internally between team members or organizational members to say, I'm really interested about learning more about this specific activity. In the case that you're implementing or developing a proposal of a specific peace building program, just to capitalize on what the project has learned on past experiences. And that can also be done not only by themes, but also by country, so by geography. So same. So if I'm sitting in a regional office or in headquarters and I wanted to see what our colleagues in Sudan are learning in general, I can just put the country, or I want to see what they are actually learning on Sudan, specifically on women empowerment. So also to start visualizing and creating these kind of knowledge maps to visualize, share, and basically capitalize on lessons learned. Last is something that we also launched recently that we're still piloting. with the whole AI integrations a little bit all over the place. So seeing how AI can do a little bit something for good and use them actually to improve the way that we capture the learnings, but also to summarize. So something that we're piloting is, for example, if you click in Sudan, you can see all the different learning activities and discoveries or findings, but you can also let our AI to make a quick summary of the key learnings, for example, of Sudan, focusing mostly on the key elements that our templates have. So basically, a little bit of the context, so overall summary, key learnings, opportunities, challenges, and key adaptations in the future to make sure that actually just to ensure what throughout the implementation of programs, what worked, what didn't, and see how that can be included, in future interventions. These summaries for the time being are not safe, and that's why we have our disclaimer on the use of FI in Propel. These summaries are not safe, just also to start distinguishing what has been created by humans versus AI on Propel. So of course, something that we still need to experiment and see how this goes. But the idea is that summaries are just created to have an overview, and then not really safe. Of course, you can copy and paste this information, but they are not safe on the software. Just to also distinguish a little bit what is human and not in Propel, and mitigating a little bit the abuse of the use of AI as well, which can be also a risk. That is a little bit in a nutshell what we're actually doing with Propel, and how we're trying to integrate, the focusing a little bit on the topic of optimizing programmatic learnings, and see how this insight, how these learnings from programs can contribute to a bigger learning agenda or strategy in terms of learning at a more organizational level. But that's the software solution, and what we're actually been busy for the last months, I would say. I don't know, Ariel, if you have any comments, questions, also team members, feel free to step in.
I just want to say thank you to all three of you for sticking around for a one-person webinar. I really appreciated getting to learn the tool and asking all the questions I had. So I really enjoyed the experience. So thank you for sticking around. I guess just one last question from me would be, you mentioned like being able to share these knowledge maps internally, but is there an intention eventually to have it so that these knowledge maps can be shared like sector wide or kind of within different organizations doing similar things?
That is music to my ears, to be honest. Because ideally, yes, particularly if you're talking about humanitarian clusters, for example,
Yeah.
talking about, WASH or any kind of shelter of sorry, cluster that they normally OCHA organize. Imagine if different organizations are willing to share their learnings, which is also a little bit of an issue on what kind of learnings are actually shared, because as we were saying, unfortunately, knowledge is power, and this is also competitive advantages for some organizations to have that learning of those practices to be more competitive towards others. In an ideal world, it will be the idea of Propel, and we were actually discussing that with Sarah, our co-founder as well, on saying how we can make these knowledge maps public in the future, or even embed these knowledge maps into organizations' websites as well, or even use it for a reporting. So you can create, you can share the link with the donor, talking about transparency as well, and say you can share the narrative report, the financial report as agreed in contract tenders, but then also say, hey, by the way, you can also have a more interactive report, just capture specific knowledge or learnings in XY topics, and you can just explore our knowledge map. So definitely something that we're trying to push and to focus, because it will be the way forward, I would say. Same as when we're talking about key indicators or key data that could be there, it will be the inclusion, for example, when you create a project of any specific SDG related area, So then you can also filter this information by SDG and by country, and it could be amazing visuals to be shared, but also insights for all kind of organizations, not only the ones who really have the power and the knowledge, but also our local CSOs that actually do the work and capture the learnings to be a little bit more independent. Let's put it that way in future proposals and programming.
Sure, for sure. That's great. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for swinging by. A great conversation. I know then that you've been in touch with Sarah, so we definitely then keep in touch, Ariel.
Sure. That sounds
And
great.